Tribune Jelian Marlaxia sat at the bar, nursing his drink, while the usual crowd of cadets and civilians drank and sang the war songs of the Grand Coalition. He'd been a soldier in the Grand Coalition armies for almost 70 galactic years. He'd risen from the lowest rank to commanding a Kurzark of 100,000 troops. For his loyal service, he was promoted to Tribune and given the option to retire or his pick of assignments. The service is all he knew, so he took the offer to teach at the academy. He drank alone most of the time. Most cadets were too intimidated to talk to him outside class. His rank, experiences, or sheer size kept most cadets from speaking to him when he was off duty. Unlike most of the academy instructors, he was one of those mythical beings, a combat veteran of many wars. Most instructors had combat experience, but usually just one or two conflicts. As part of his interview with the academy commandant, his service record was reviewed. He was surprised by some of the details in it. After 70 years of combat service, it all blurred together. He had fought in 22 wars, 642 major engagements, numerous skirmishes, and more than a few barroom brawls. He shrugged at the last one. He came up through the ranks and became an officer by battlefield commission. He wasn't an officer and an aristocrat like most of the cadets he taught. He was almost 3 meters tall and massively muscled, like all soldiers from Tralaxia. Numerous scars crisscrossed his entire body, especially his 4 arms and the curled horns on his head. So he was surprised when a cadet from the newest class approached him, pushed by his friends, of course. Tribune Marlaxia? The young Kitaran stuttered. Yes, cadet? He replied, while trying to remember its name. Cadet Skin, sir, the young cadet answered. Ah, yes. What can I do for you, cadet? Jalian inquired. He tried to keep from smiling at how scared the Kitaran looked, ears flat, tail tucked between his legs, and barely able to look up at him. Sir, if it's okay, the cadet asked, trying to overcome his nervousness. We were talking about who were the best soldiers in the Coalition military. Is that all? Jalian chuckled. And how do you mean the best? The best fighters? The bravest warriors? The strongest soldiers? The canniest troops? Or the most reliable to get the job done? The cadet looked to his friends for help, but none was given. I don't know, sir. His voice barely audible. Jalian smiled and decided to take pity on the young Kitarin. He took a pull from his drink and signaled the bartender for another. As she slid the drink to him, she shared that amused look she always had when he was going to tell a tale. After another pull at his fresh drink, he put it down and turned around on his stool. You asked about the best soldiers in our military, but I will instead tell you of my experience with the best soldiers that I've ever fought beside. The rest of the bar's patrons quietened down, as they realized they might get to hear him share some of his past experiences. They weren't part of our military, but one of the few allies willing to step up when the Razith invaded our space. Jelian's eyes stared at nothing, as he tried to remember how long ago it was. About 30 cycles ago it was. They'd sent a large force against a small colony world, Razith 6. Taking another pull from his drink before continuing. I was just a Chiliad then, commanding a Millenarch of heavy infantry. The entire Tetachar had been sent to evacuate the civilians before the Razith arrived. At the time, most of us thought sending 10,000 soldiers to evacuate 6,000 civilians was overkill. He shook his head before continuing, but we hadn't met the Razith in combat before. Jelian looked around the room before continuing. Cadets learn about the Razith in their 3rd year, so for the younger cadets and the civilians in the room, I better explain who the Razith were. The Razith were a species that originated from the fringe of the Xanetic sector out on the galactic rim. That area had never been explored, being so far out. It was later found to have contained several sapient species, all conquered by the Razith. What did they look like? One of the cadets piped up. Jellian turned to look at the cadet. They were big, only slightly shorter than me. Their lower body was sinuous, and having no legs, they moved by lateral undulation. Their dorsal side was covered in short spikes that ended in a stinger that could inject paralytic venom in some species. They had 2 arms that ended in a 6-digit manus with retractable claws, and another pair of appendages that could function as arms, for grasping or being used to increase their speed when moving. They had 2 sets of eyes, one for normal light, and the other for low light. They had a wide maw with rows of sharp fangs for ripping apart flesh and metal. Their whole body was covered in tough scales that sometimes deflect laser and plasma bolts if you didn't hit them square on. Draining his mug, Jellian continued. To them, other sapiens were either food or slaves. He turned around to see the entire bar focused on him. A delegation sent to make contact after they attacked a small outpost found that out the hard way. Only one of the group was allowed to live to deliver a single message: surrender or die. The Katana Council didn't take them seriously, and put together a small fleet to punish these upstarts. After all, the survivor reported they only had a dozen ships. None came back. Jellian drained the rest of his drink and set the mug on the bar. A recon ship that had been sent out returned with word that the Razith fleet was far larger than reported. Hundreds of capital ships, thousands of escorts, and what we assumed were troop ships. With our fleet scattered across Coalition territory, we needed to buy time for them to join the Grand Fleet. So dozens of squadrons were sent to evacuate all colonies and stations, directly in the enemy's path, Jellian said, his eyes staring at nothing as he spoke. We didn't know the Razith had also sent out their groups of raiders to seize any supplies they could, and in their case, the colonists were just another source of food. Jellian began to reach for his mug, remembering it was empty just before grasping it, so he was pleasantly surprised to find it full again. So our small fleet reached Razith 6 and took orbit above the main settlement. A message had been sent for the colony to gather all their people in the main settlement and be evacuated from there. With none of our ships capable of atmospheric maneuvering, we were reduced to using shuttles and other smaller craft to load the colonists and their belongings. It would take some time to lift 6,000 colonists, their animals, and a few belongings to the ships in orbit. Jellian gave a small chuckle as he remembered the argument between the fleet commander and the Teltarch over the colonists' animals. He'd finally convinced the fleet commander that they were here to rescue the colonists and deny the Razith of supplies. Being carnivorous, the colonists' animals were a food supply for them and couldn't be left behind. He also pointed out that simply destroying them to the point of being inedible would take too long, agitate the colonists, and significantly slow down the evac time more than just taking the animals would. One of the older cadets spoke up. Sir, are you okay? Bringing Jellian back to the present. I apologize. I was lost in a memory. Now, where was I? He thought out loud. Ah yes, the evacuation, he said. We'd been at it for several centanks when we received word of hostile ships entering the system. The fleet commander took all but 2 destroyers to engage the enemy, while we tried to speed up the evacuation. But you can only move so fast with the number of shuttles we had. Taking another pull of his drink, good thing it isn't very strong or I'd be under a table before I'm done, he said to himself. My Teltarch conferred with the fleet commander and a distress signal was sent out for more ships to assist in the effort. He was also informed of several ships heading for the planet's surface, most likely ground troops. The area around the settlement wasn't very defensible, so he moved the LZ to a nearby plateau, and moved the rest of the colonists that way. The colonists would often take their livestock to graze on the top of the plateau, so there was a well-worn path. And even better, some of the livestock naturally began to climb the trail to their grazing spot. The path up was mostly rock and dirt with some vegetation here and there, he continued. It leveled off into 3 different benches as you ascended. This allowed a brief rest for some of the slower colonists. The plateau was bulbous where the pathway exited on it. Sheer cliffs along nearly all sides provided added protection, and the land narrowed to a bluff over the river far below. A wide spot at the farthest end of the bluff was just big enough for an LZ. His hands helped show what he meant. The Tetrarch began breaking off Millenarch at the base, and at each bench to hold off the Razith, Julian recalled. Each level could be supported from the defensive line above, and with either side of that steep slope being a sheer cliff face, it looked like a tough weonate to crack. After deploying 5 Millenarch along the trail from the bottom, over 3 benches and a line on top, that left 5 hours to assist in the evac and build backup defensive lines. My Millenarch was to hold the second bench, he explained. Julian was starting to enjoy sharing this with the crowd. He didn't talk about it often, but oh did he dream about it. The nightmares weren't as frequent now, but every so often they plague his sleep. The sights, sounds, and smells of that desperate fight. The screams of the wounded and dying, feeling the battle slip out of his control. We got word from the fleet commander that his battle was going well, but neither side had an edge, Julian said. We also got some intel back from AI-controlled recon craft about the multiple formations of the enemy sacking and burning anything they came across, and all heading our way. His throat getting dry, he took a drink from his mug and then continued. We had our first contact with the Razith not long after that report. There were less than a Millenarch of them. We opened up as soon as they came into range, and got the nasty surprise of finding out that their scales gave them some defense against laser and plasma fire. Here and there one went down, but nowhere near the numbers expected. His eyes took on a haunted look. We hadn't even eliminated a quarter of them before they hit the first line of defense, and rolled right over it. A favorite tactic was to grab one of our troopers with a lower set of appendages on the torso, entangle them, and then either bite into them, sting them with their tail, or simply rip them apart. I'd never seen such savagery, at least by that time of my life. By the time we drove them back, over half the first Millenarch were dead, dying, or seriously wounded. They'd also dragged a few poor bastards back with them, and we could hear their agonizing screams. The Tetrarch sent some of the troopers from the plateau to remove the wounded and dying. The dead were piled up and incinerated with thermocharges. Taking another drink, he continued. Normally we would try to give the appropriate fallen funerary services, but we didn't have the time, and we knew what happened to our dead. He also sent more troops to reinforce the first line. Julian paused before adding, it wasn't enough. We barely managed to fend off 2 more attacks, and had to abandon the first line of defense, Julian said. And even more worrying were more and more Razith arriving on the field. It was becoming obvious that we couldn't hold them off forever. Evacuation was only about halfway done, and we'd already lost over a Millenarch of dead and wounded. Word also trickled down from above that Razith reinforcements had arrived to bolster their fleet. Julian's eyes stared at the wall behind the cadets before he continued. It wasn't going well for ships now, with 2 destroyed and 1 disabled. The Razith reinforcements also forced our transport ships to break orbit and flee from a pair of warships that approached them. Once again, Julian's mind wandered as he remembered the hopelessness that engulfed those still on the ground. He shook off his thoughts and continued. The next assault nearly destroyed what morale we had left. We found out the damn things could climb the rock walls. They were hitting us on every level and atop the plateau. It was no longer an organized battle, but a swirling mass of small groups fighting for their lives, and to keep the Razith from the civilians. Julian suppressed a shudder at the recalled fear of that chaos. And just when things seemed hopeless, they arrived. Taking a long pull of his drink and taking a moment to focus his thoughts. Several people in the crowd asked the same question. Who? The entire crowd looked eager for the answer. The humans. Julian gave a simple answer. At the crowd's bewilderment, he explained. Yes, I know that for most of you, your only experience is with their traders and travelers. They don't look that tough, but you'd be surprised at how tough they truly are. And their military forces are downright scary. They aren't as big or strong as other soldiers in our armies, nor do they have any natural weapons or armor. What they do have are units that function just as well independently as they do in larger formations. Their troops are well trained, disciplined, and brave to the point of idiocy. Jolyon gave a slight smile, as he remembered the elation that someone heard their call. I learned later that they were just a small fleet passing through a nearby system, but didn't hesitate to respond. Their half-dozen warships immediately attacked the Razith fleet in their flank, and threw them into chaos. Their larger supply ship could land and take off from a planetary surface, and had plenty of room to take the rest of us off the planet in one shot. But the plateau wasn't big enough to land on. But they solved the problem with human efficiency, Jolyon continued. They set down on a nearby ridge and used the shuttles to ferry people and animals over to it. It was a far quicker process than going back and forth between a ship in orbit. But I am getting ahead of myself. We were on the verge of being overrun when a noise I'd never heard before came from above and behind me. Humans in black body armor and firing projectile weapons were advancing down the path and firing into the mass of Razith fighters. And their weapons were far more effective than our energy-based weapons. They fired explosive-tipped projectiles that exploded on contact. This reduced the chance of a deflection to almost zero. Their shots just punched through Razith scales like they weren't there. Jolyon looked around the bar, seeing the crowd hung on his every word. With their help, we managed to not only repulse the Razith from the path and plateau, but also their dropships chased them back to the settlement. Jolyon drained his mug again before continuing. I'd never seen a human up close before. They were bipedal and had a single pair of arms. After their leader removed her helmet, I also saw they had 2 eyes on the front of their face and 2 ears on the side of their head. Directly below and between their eyes was a single proboscis and a single mouth with small teeth. Most of them had some form of fur-like tufts on their head. The human commander came up to me, evidently familiar with our rank badges, and greeted me. I was effusive in my reply because they just saved our asses. Forgive me if I don't recall our exact conversation, but it has been a long time since that day. Jolyon tried to recall as much of the convo as he could. She'd introduced herself as Captain Mendez of the United Terra Marines, and they thought they'd drop in to give a hand with these fucking jabbers. One of the cadets asked, "What's a jabber?" It was an insulting nickname for the Razith when I asked about it. She just called it a classical reference. They officially called them Gorgons. It refers to a creature from their ancient mythologies. Something to keep in mind, humans are fond of humour and understanding the difficulty or danger of a situation. They are also fond of calling things by nicknames, which could be good or bad. Human military personnel most of all. Jolyon recalled the enjoyment he got when they later taught him banter. If a human likes you, they like to joke around with you. That is usually a good thing. But I have found very few things scarier than when a human is deadly serious. Jolyon paused before continuing. When they get like that, some serious violence is about to happen. They always fight hard, but often in a more clinical fashion, like we do. But when a human soldier gets that serious, they will fight with a frightening level of ferocity. I was once on a scouting mission with 24 human marines. We were investigating why a Bakiri settlement stopped responding to hails. It turned out that Bagrati pirates had hit the settlement and killed or kidnapped the people to sell at the slave markets. Jolyon could still remember the anger he felt at the scene. But they didn't take the Bakiri children with them. They executed them. That was the first time I saw a human soldier become deadly serious. We caught up to those pirates, and even though they were outnumbered by the pirates, they killed every one of them and didn't lose a man. And they didn't just kill them, they beat many of them to death with weapons, tools, furniture, or just using their closed manus and boots. I saw one even use a Bagrati's arm to beat the pirate to death. This will be relevant later, I promise. As I was saying, the Marine captain introduced herself and we began exchanging tactical information. It was also around this time that I found out I was the most senior officer left alive and became in charge of this mission. Now that we knew they could simply climb the sides, we decided it was easier to form a defensive perimeter on top of the plateau. We only had a few more shuttle trips left in the evacuation, Jolyon said. So we left a squad of human marines on the last bench and started to build a defensive line across the neck of the bluff. We also dug out a sheltered area for the refugees to hide while waiting. That is also when I found out Captain Mendez only brought 250 Marines. I asked the captain about it and she smiled and told me each Marine is worth 10 of those damn jabbers, so he got them outnumbered. Several cadets laughed at that, enjoying the disdain showed to the Razith. I only had just over 4,000 combat-effective coalition troopers, 1,000 of which I sent to guard the human vessel, and to take all injured or dead. The Razith were horrible shots and preferred volume of fire over accuracy. I probably wouldn't be here if they could shoot worth a damn, Jalian said, kidding on the square. I placed half a Millenarch with the refugees and spread some pickets along the edge of the plateau. Meanwhile, the humans took position on the front line with a pair of rapid-fire railguns. We got the front line trenches and secondary breastworks dug when the squad of Marines came jogging back and said they were coming. Jalian took a pull at his nearly empty mug before continuing. I pulled in the pickets, and we got ready to fight. The first wave came up on the trail, and as they burst onto the top, those rapid-fire railguns ripped them apart. Razith body parts were flying everywhere, and in no time, they swept the plateau clean of Razith soldiers. But we got word many more were heading our way. They attacked from the trail, and by climbing the sides of the cliffs, 10 times they came, and 10 times we threw them back. The memory of the desperation came roaring back to him. The last time they got into the trenches where vicious melee combat broke out, the humans pointed out a weak spot under their chin that weapons fire or even knives could penetrate with ease. With this knowledge, we gave better than we got, as an old human saying goes. But the cost had been heavy. More than half of my remaining troops were down. Fortunately more wounded than dead, Jalian said. And despite their much stronger armor, less than 100 Marines were still able to fight. But a bigger problem was all but 2 shuttles were still flying. The Razith shot down 2 and damaged 5 others heavily enough to pull them from duty. At least we finished evacuating the last of the refugees and their animals. Now we were ferrying over our dead and wounded. The Razith came again, and we barely drove them back. Jalian paused before continuing. It was at that point we abandoned the trenches and moved everyone that was left to the second line. Unfortunately, the rapid-fire railguns are out of action. There were only 60 Marines and just over 1,000 coalition troops in the defensive lines. Jalian looked out at his audience and saw they were intently focused on his tail. I took about half my troopers and built one last fallback position just before the bluff opened up to the LZ. After that, there was nowhere to go. Each successive attack chipped away at our shrinking defense force. A steady stream of wounded flowed to the LZ, but finally, the last of us would be evacuated on the next 2 shuttles. And that was when tragedy struck. During a lull, the surviving troops fell back, and the Marines manned that last line of defense. I protested, but the human captain pointed out that their much heavier armor would allow them to retreat under fire better. With a look of great sadness on his face, Jalian continued. Word came from above that a large number of Razith ships were inbound, and the surviving coalition ships and human ships were forced to scoop up all their escape pods and what survivors they could get to on the wrecked ships and fall back to the ships stationed above us. We'd have time for the last 2 shuttles to make a run and pick us all up, and then we'd have to lift off immediately. There was a very small window of time before the fleet could jump, and the Razith reinforcements were in range. The first shuttle landed, and I got the last of my Hell Troopers, and the last of the human and coalition dead and wounded. We lifted off to allow the other shuttle to land, but Razith's fire hit it, and turned it into a brilliant fireball crashing into the valley floor below. 32 Marines, including Captain Mendez, were still on the bluff below. They had fallen back to the LZ with the Razith not far behind. I rushed to the cockpit to tell the pilot to go back for them, but he told me they were too heavily loaded. I suggested abandoning the dead to make room. He agreed, and I called the captain to be ready for pickup, but she said there was no time. She ordered the pilot to return to their ship and dock. She then called the freighter and told him to lift off as soon as we docked. I protested, but the pilot replied he had to follow her orders, Jalian said. I was still in the cockpit when she called the human fleet commander and said those 3 words I will never forget. Drop Thor's hammer. The human fleet commander made her repeat the order, and I could hear the sadness in his voice as he gave an affirmative to her reply. The captain simply replied, "OORAH!" Jalian drained his drink before continuing, and then I heard my pilot and what sounded like every human with a radio return the phrase. Our pilot mumbled something about Valhalla and practically crash-landed us in the freighter hangar. We hadn't even dropped the rams before I heard the doors clang shut and felt the engines roar as we lifted off. I asked the pilot what the phrase "drop Thor's hammer" meant, and he just turned on a monitor hooked into the fleet feed from a recon drone. The Marines were surrounded by the Razith and fighting hard, with most of them down. Jalian sighed. It was then I saw a streak of light race down and hit the LZ. It turned into a massive fireball, and then a massive plume of smoke and debris rose from it, into a hurricane fruit-shaped cloud. I looked at both pilots and saw tears on their faces. One of them explained to me that "drop Thor's hammer" meant to drop a nuke on their position. I asked why she did it, and the pilot replied, so he wouldn't try and risk the fleet by returning for them. And that is why I say they are the best I ever fought with. They came to help us when they didn't have to. They fought shoulder to shoulder with us, and in the end, they sacrificed themselves to make sure we would survive. Jalian scanned the crowd, seeing them shocked, amazed, and even saddened at that action. And now, cadets, it's late, and we get up early. And with that, Jalian set down his empty mug, signed his credit chit, and left the bar.